Hello and welcome back to An Old Man Watches, where today I'm going to be talking about the 2013 fantasy adventure Saga, Curse of the Shadow, which you can also find under several other names, including Rise of the Shadow Warrior, which is the title I first saw it under, Curse of the Dragon Slayer. Basically, if you see a 2013 fantasy movie that has the words Saga, Curse, or Shadow in the title, particularly in combination, there's a pretty good chance it's this film. The movie begins with the deadly elven bounty hunter Nemit, who tracks down and slays a powerful shaman of the nefarious Shadow Cabal. Now, the fight's a tough one, but it turns out that killing the shaman was actually the easy part. With his dying breath, he curses Nemit. Among other effects, this marks her with the seal of the Shadow Cabal. So when she goes to collect the bounty on the guy, Nemit finds herself thrown into prison on suspicion of being one of the bad guys. Fortunately, the fake seal also tricks a fellow prisoner who is a member of the Cabal into sharing secrets with Namit. When he realizes that she isn't in fact an ally, he attacks Namit and she kills him. This turns out to be a fortunate thing, since when a holy knight named Kellis reaches the city in pursuit of the Shadow Cabal, Nemit is the only one left alive who can tell him anything about it. So the pair strike a deal. Nemit will help Kellis with his mission. He's just got to stop a ceremony to summon the death god, no biggie. And in return, she will get fully exonerated and Kellis will find someone to help her get rid of the seal that's been placed upon her. The reluctant duo are soon joined by a third, somewhat more enthusiastic colleague, the orc Culliman. Rejected by his orcish brethren, Culliman proves to be a brave companion. But can three such disparate personalities find a way to work together and stop the Shadow Cabal, or will the Death God lay waste to the world? So this film comes from Arrowstorm Entertainment, who also produced the Mythica films, which I reviewed back in September last year. Like those movies, this one was partially funded by a crowdfunding process, which raised around 33,000 US dollars. I don't know what the total budget was, but if 33,000 made a difference, then by movie standards, it wasn't a big budget at all. So with that in mind, I have to praise the film's costumes and makeups, which are solid. It's also got better than you might expect acting. Danielle Chukran is clearly a cut above the rest of the cast, who um, seem to think that emoting very broadly will cover up for a lack of nuance. But there's no one distractingly bad here, which is more than I can say for many low-budget films, and even a few high-budget ones. I quite enjoyed this movie the first time I saw it. I'm not sure it stands up too well to repeat viewings. The second time I watched it, I definitely noticed the flaws more than the strengths. But it does have both flaws and strengths, so why don't I talk about them and you can make up your own mind. And let's start with something that could be both a strength or a flaw, depending on your perspective, which is that Saga, Curse of the Shadow is unapologetic travelogue fantasy. Now, in case you don't know, travelogue fantasy is a narrative in which a mishmash band of heroes roam from portentously named landmark to portentously named landmark in an attempt to thwart an ancient evil, and their experiences over the journey allow them to recognize each other's strengths and work together more effectively. It's been a staple of the fantasy genre ever since The Hobbit saw Bilbo Baggins reluctantly set out with some dwarves he'd only just met to roam through Rivendell, the Misty Mountains, Mirkwood, and the Long Lake before finally fetching up at the lair of the dread dragon Smaug. I guess that at least, unlike his nephew Frodo in The Lord of the Rings, Bilbo didn't have to contend with the Mines of Moria, the Dead Marchers, or Mount Doom. This film's narrative wholeheartedly embraces the tropes of the travelogue fantasy form, hewing rather more to the episodic structure of Bilbo's adventure than the more epic grandeur of The Lord of the Rings. So, how you feel about such fantasy tales will absolutely impact how you feel about this movie. Now, to be fair, the film does sneak in a few subversions of the classic fantasy tropes. The most notable of these is the orc Culliman. Tolkien pretty firmly established orcs on the antagonist side of the ledger, and outside of a few deconstructions like Mary Gentle's grunts, the bulk of fantasy has been content to leave them there. But while there are plenty of orcs on the side of evil in this film, Culliman is clearly a good guy. He is in fact notably more humane than the cold-blooded killer for hire Nimit or the zealous holy knight Kellis. This is a fun element of the film for me, I think, particularly since it also works to subvert the standard human-elf-dwarf fantasy troika, a trope which was once again founded by the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. There is a dwarf in this film, I should mention, but he's an irascible villain with a penchant for explosives. That's not an entirely successful element to the movie, to my mind. He does feel a bit like he comes from a different setting than everybody else, but it's, again, a more deliberate subversion. I think you could also make an argument that Namit, who is cold-hearted and pragmatic with little of the grave poise of a Tolkien elf, is also a subversion. But I'm not sure it would be a strong argument. Nemit's elvishness is largely an informed trait, something we're told by the dialogue and her makeup, but not something that is really shown in her character's personality. She could be a human and there'd be no difference. Culliman, meanwhile, does feel orcish, even while he's subverting some orcish traits. The big weaknesses of the film, on the other hand, are structural. For one thing, the introduction sequences for all three main characters are quite similar, a fact which is particularly noticeable given that they are done back to back in the movie. And for a second thing, the film's episodic nature does mean there are several sequences in the movie that could have been cut, and the only real impact would be that the runtime would be a bit shorter. The most obvious such sequence is when Culliman swims across a lake and is attacked by malevolent mermaids. He ultimately fends them off without any lasting consequences, and the scene is never mentioned again. I get the sense that having conceived the scene, the producers just couldn't bear, or possibly couldn't really afford after filming it, to let it go. But it doesn't factor before, it doesn't factor after. It's just some time and a bit of an action sequence. Third, there are several moments where the script is clearly aiming to recreate certain iconic scenes of fantasy literature with decidedly mixed results. And fourth and finally, I have issues with the way the writing tends to undercut Nemit's capability. We're told she's highly competent, but other than her successful assassination at the very beginning of the movie, it seems like every time she gets a moment to shine in the film, the script promptly pulls the rug out from under her. So yeah, ultimately, this film is a mixed bag. You'll need to make up your own mind, but I'd definitely say the more you're into fantasy media, the more likely you are to enjoy the good bits and overlook the bad ones. Next time, Flash Gordon is one of my favourite films for its stonking Queen soundtrack, grandiose sets and costumes, and complete lack of restraint. But it was far from the first big screen picture inspired by the comic strip hero. There are all those 1930s serials with Buster Crabbe, for instance. And then there was Flesh Gordon, a 1974 sex romp parody that rather subverts the usual sex romp parody formula by actually being pretty fun to watch. But that is next time. Until then, thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you've seen Saga, Curse of the Shadow, let me know what you thought of it.